Welcome to Pseudobiblia. Today, Pseudobiblia presents The Strange Case of the March Burr, an unpublished Sherlock Holmes tale, Part 2, a novel written by Atanasio Pernati. Enjoy listening. Part 4, The Revelations. Chapter 9, Preparations for Truth. A stabbing pain, as if a red-hot nail were piercing my temples, was the first brutal sensation that tore me from a deep and unnatural sleep. I opened my eyes with difficulty, my eyelids sticky, and was greeted not by the reassuring light of day, but by a darkness still dense, illuminated only by the faint glow of dying embers in the fireplace of our sitting room at 221B Baker Street. For an instant, I floated in a state of torpid confusion, unable to distinguish dream from waking, memory from nightmare. Then, gradually, reality made its way through. The first figure I brought into focus was that of Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard. He was bent over me, his usually ruddy face now contracted in an expression of sincere concern in the uncertain light of a petroleum lamp he must have lit. Beside him, standing erect like a denser shadow in the darkness, was Sherlock Holmes. His aquiline profile was tense, and although his bearing was, as always, controlled in his grey and penetrating eyes, which reflected the lamp's flame, I caught an unusual note of apprehension, a human participation in my evident state of prostration. "Watson, at last!" exclaimed Gregson, his voice a restrained relief. "By all the devils, Doctor, you had us fearing the worst." I tried to raise myself on my elbows, but a sharp pain in my head, accompanied by a sense of nausea, forced me to fall back heavily onto the cushions of my armchair, where they had evidently laid me. "Holmes, Gregson," I mumbled, my voice hoarse and thick, my throat dry as if I had swallowed brick dust. What happened? Confused fragments of the previous evening, or was it already deep night, began to swirl chaotically in my mind. The black room, Thorne's invocations, the figures that vanished and reappeared like phantoms. And then that blinding light, the white room, and the innocent, heartbreaking face of little Lucy. "Lucy," I murmured, a wave of anguish and an inexplicably sweet pain still gripping my heart. "I saw her, Holmes. She was there, so real." Holmes approached with silent steps, his face now more clearly visible in the lamplight. He offered me a glass containing an amber liquid with a pungent aroma. "Drink this, Watson," he said, and his voice, usually so firm and analytical, betrayed a rare note of gentleness, almost of solicitude. "A sip of good brandy will help dispel these shadows. You have undergone a rather demanding experience." The liquor burned my throat beneficially, sending a restorative warmth through my numbed limbs and still foggy mind. "Demanding, Holmes," I repeated, my voice still unsteady but regaining some strength. "It was devastating. That child was my daughter." "My Lucy, my dear Watson," replied Holmes, and in his tone there was a shade of deep understanding, almost of regret. "What you saw, what you felt with such painful intensity, was the fruit of an extremely vivid and realistic hallucination, induced by a powerful narcotic substance administered to you without your knowledge, and amplified by the consummate skill of an actress trained to manipulate the deepest and most sensitive chords of the human soul. I understand how touching, even shattering it may have been for you, given the still open wounds of your heart, but I assure you, with absolute certainty, that what you saw did not belong to the world of tangible reality." His words, spoken calmly, but with a firmness that admitted no doubt, were like a lash of icy wind that began to dispel the mists of my confusion. The crude, scientific truth behind the miracle of the previous evening began to make its way into my mind, leaving me with a bitter taste of disappointment, and I must confess with deep shame, a touch of anger at having let myself be so completely ensnared, despite my medical profession and my long experience at Holmes's side. "You fainted during the séance, when that commotion began," intervened Gregson, with a more practical and reassuring tone. "Mr. Holmes supported you, and as soon as the situation calmed down a bit and my men took control, brought you here. We had your colleague, Dr. Anstruther, called, who examined you while you were unconscious. He confirmed the effects of a toxic substance, but said that, apart from severe nervous shock and a probable migraine, there should be no permanent damage. You have slept for several hours. It is still deep night." "The drug," I repeated, as the pieces of the puzzle began painfully to fit together. The tea, and perhaps those strange exhalations in the black room. Precisely, Watson, confirmed Holmes. But now that you are back among us, and I hope with a somewhat clearer mind, I should like to ask if you feel able to rise and accompany us. Inspector Gregson has taken care to secure justice for those responsible, or at least most of them. But I believe the time has come to show you the complete result of our nocturnal investigation and to unveil the entire mechanism of this diabolical and ingenious fraud. Seeing with your own eyes, I believe, will help dispel any residual doubt and restore your analytical mind to its customary and precious equilibrium. Despite my head still pulsing, as if about to burst, and feeling physically and emotionally prostrated, the desire to understand, to see the naked and crude truth behind that charade that had so deeply and personally touched my most intimate chords, was stronger than any physical malaise. I nodded with what little strength remained. I shall come with you, Holmes. I must understand. As I composed myself, aided by a second, generous sip of brandy that Holmes offered me with unusual solicitude, my friend briefly retired to his room. He emerged shortly after, having replaced the elegant evening dress of Lord Julian Wayne with his more practical city clothes, the worn grey tweed that had so many times faithfully accompanied him in his most arduous investigations. I noticed that, before donning his heavy overcoat, he carefully placed in the inner pocket of his jacket a small volume bound in dark leather, a detail that, at the moment, my still clouded mind was unable to interpret. A few minutes later, while the first, uncertain lights of a cold and grey dawn were just beginning to tinge the sky above London's rooftops, we were again in a carriage that Gregson had kept waiting, directed, for the third time in what seemed like weeks, toward the fateful building on Fleet Street. This time, however, the atmosphere was quite different from that of the previous evening, charged no longer with mystery and trembling apprehension, but with the cold and implacable light of truth about to be unveiled and of justice that it was hoped would soon be done. Chapter 10. Return to Fleet Street. As the carriage jolted over the wet and deserted cobblestones of a London just awakening, Holmes addressed Inspector Gregson. "Are the acetylene lanterns ready, Inspector? We shall need to illuminate that apartment like daylight, to banish every residual shadow and every possible illusion." "Yes, Mr. Holmes," replied Gregson with an affirmative nod. "Everything prepared as per your instructions. My men have been on site for several hours and have secured the entire area." It was then that Holmes, with a more subdued tone and a rare note of contrition in his voice, which I had rarely heard him use, turned to me. "Watson," he began, and his hand rested for a fleeting instant on my shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie and almost embarrassed apology. "I must offer you my most sincere apologies. I had not foreseen, or perhaps I culpably underestimated, that the charade of these individuals could have such a personal and deeply painful impact upon you, subjecting you to such an ordeal, especially given your recent and so keenly felt loss, was perhaps a gamble on my part, an excess of confidence in your considerable capacity for discernment even in extreme circumstances. I fear I underestimated the devastating power of certain artifices when they intertwine with the most intimate and still bleeding wounds of the soul. I was sincerely surprised and touched by his unusual and so direct manifestation of apology. "Do not torment yourself needlessly, Holmes," I replied, although the memory of little Lucy was still a painful knot in my chest. It was an intense experience, without doubt, but the necessity of unmasking such a cruel machination far outweighs any personal discomfort. And besides, I added, trying to lighten the atmosphere with a thread of forced irony, it is not every day one becomes a father, albeit for a few hallucinatory and heartbreaking minutes. Gregson, who was observing us with a mixture of respect for Holmes and palpable perplexity at the almost intimate turn our conversation was taking, shook his head vigorously. "I still cannot fathom how the devil they managed to make those people disappear and reappear as if they had been swallowed by nothingness, Mr. Holmes. It seemed like real black magic, I assure you, stuff to make even an old Scotland Yard wolf like myself stand on end." Holmes smiled, and in his eyes shone again that spark of keen and almost amused intellect that I so admired and sometimes feared. No black magic, Inspector, rest assured. Only skillful mechanical engineering, conjuring tricks worthy of the best Maskelyne or Devant, and a deep, cynical knowledge of the psychology of human perception when altered by powerful narcotics. Shortly, every trick will be unveiled in the cold light of dawn, which, as you see, is beginning to brighten the sky. We arrived in Fleet Street. The scene was one of controlled but feverish chaos. The building, which the previous evening had been wrapped in an aura of mystery and sinister expectation, was now the center of a visible deployment of police forces. A cordon of uniformed officers, whose helmets gleamed faintly in the uncertain morning light, surrounded the building, keeping at bay a small crowd of early morning curiosity seekers who had already gathered, despite the hour, on the opposite pavement, attracted by the commotion. Some tenants from other floors, evidently evacuated hastily during the night, lingered in small groups, wrapped in heavy coats and shawls worn over hastily donned nightgowns. Their expressions were an eloquent mixture of indignation at the disturbance to their quiet, residual fear of the inexplicable events of the night, and a morbid, irrepressible curiosity about what was really happening in their, until yesterday, respectable and tranquil apartment building. In the midst of that turmoil, the surly and indignant figure of Mr. Grubb, the building's owner, stood out. He was purple in the face, and gesticulating animatedly with a police sergeant of patient but firm demeanor. As soon as his rapacious eyes fell upon Holmes's figure descending from the carriage, his face contracted in a grimace of rage and recrimination. He pushed through the crowd and came toward us with a threatening step. "Holmes, damn you and your outlandish investigations," he shouted, his voice hoarse and charged with animosity. "My respectable building, my select and paying clientele. Look what scandal you have created. Rental prices will plummet after such a shameful affair. It is all your fault and your obsessions. I hope at least that you have caught those rascals who infested my property, and that you, Mr. Holmes, will compensate me to the last penny for the damage to my reputation and the economic losses that this escapade of yours will cause me." Holmes faced him with glacial and impassive superiority, which seemed to freeze the owner's outbursts. "Truth, Mr. Grubb," he replied with a voice sharp as a razor blade, "often has a price, and sometimes it is a price that the dishonest and avaricious struggle to pay. But I believe that, in the long run, you yourself will appreciate more a building cleared of matriculated criminals and cynical manipulators of souls, rather than a den of deceptions whose reputation, however lucrative for your pockets, is founded on illusions, drugs, and the most abject speculation on the pain of others. And now, if you will have the courtesy to excuse us, we still have work to complete to ensure that the cleaning is thorough and definitive." Without deigning him further attention, and leaving Mr. Grubb to mutter furious but now subdued imprecations, we made our way through the police cordon, directed toward the building's entrance. The fresh morning air was charged with palpable tension and questions that still awaited a definitive answer. What ingenious and diabolical mechanism lay behind those disappearances, and those visions, so realistic as to have deceived even my medical mind? And how had Holmes managed to orchestrate the police intervention so precisely and timely, taking advantage of that sound, hunting horn or whatever it was, that had so abruptly interrupted the séance, and which, evidently, had had the sole purpose of being heard from outside, serving as an agreed signal? The solution was within reach, I was certain, and the rising sun would soon illuminate every dark corner of this incredible affair. Chapter 11. The Scene of the Crime. Having passed the entrance guarded by a sleepy-looking officer, we found ourselves in the poorly lit atrium of the building. Holmes approached a stack of acetylene lanterns that Gregson's men had evidently prepared near the door as per his instructions. He took one, of robust manufacture, and with a quick gesture lit the flint mechanism. A white and hissing flame erupted, projecting a cone of crude and implacable light that chased away the densest shadows. Gregson took another, imitating him, and with a nod ordered a couple of his men to do likewise. "We shall need all possible light," murmured Holmes, more to himself than to us. We climbed the worn stairs, our steps echoing gloomily in the unnatural silence of the building. Arriving at the third-floor landing, before the door of the apartment that had been the theatre of so many deceptions, the scene that appeared before us was, to say the least, desolate. Lying on makeshift beds, some blankets and cushions hastily retrieved and spread directly on the cold floor, lay Lady Alina Vance, the industrialist's widow, Mrs. Pemberton, and the bearded nobleman, Sir Geoffrey. They slept, but it was a heavy, unnatural sleep, clearly induced by powerful substances. Their bodies were shaken by slight but frequent spasms, their limbs contracted in unconscious movements, and their faces, even in the half-light of the landing lit only by the light filtering from the stairwell, showed slightly deformed expressions, grotesque masks of a nightmare from which they could not awaken. Deeply narcotized, commented Holmes in a low voice, observing them with a mixture of cold analysis, and it seemed to me a touch of human pity. It will take hours, perhaps a full day, before the effects of the stramonium completely vanish from their systems, and the psychological consequences, I fear, may persist much longer. He signaled to an officer to remain on guard, with instructions to call a doctor immediately once we had secured the interior. Gregson, with a decisive kick that betrayed no delicacy, flung open the apartment door. "Light those lanterns," he ordered his men who followed us. "I want to see every corner of this damned den of serpents." We entered the atrium, which the previous evening, in the studded half-light and at the peak of my suggestibility, had appeared to me as an elegant and mysterious sitting room, now revealed itself, in the crude and pitiless light of the acetylene lanterns, for what it really was: a squalid environment, furnished with cheap rubbish and theatrical junk, skillfully arranged to simulate a luxury and refinement that were entirely non-existent. The precious tapestries were of cheap and worn fabric. The antique furniture were crude imitations artificially darkened, and the furnishings I had admired the previous evening proved to be worthless trinkets. Holmes, without hesitation, with the confidence of one who knows exactly where to look, headed immediately to the left, toward the small service door through which, the previous evening, we had seen the well-groomed butler with pomaded mustaches enter and exit several times. He opened the door, and we found ourselves in a narrow little kitchen, malodorous with stale tea and indefinable sweetish aromas. There, seated on a rickety stool, with his hands handcuffed behind his back, and under the surveillance of another officer, sat Roger, Professor Fassbender's assistant. His face, in the direct light of Holmes's lantern, showed an air halfway between resigned and brazen, like one who, though caught red-handed, refuses to show remorse. Ignoring him for the moment, Holmes began to inspect with meticulous rapidity the cupboards and shelves of the little kitchen. He sniffed expertly at some 20 jars and boxes containing powders, dried herbs, and infusions of various kinds. His nose, like an infallible bloodhound, finally guided him toward a seemingly innocent wooden panel, part of a tall and narrow wall cupboard that went from floor almost to ceiling. With a sharp and precise blow, Holmes opened the door of that cupboard. For a very brief instant, my friend peered inside, and I saw an imperceptible stiffening of his features, a fleeting flash in his eyes that I could not interpret. He closed the door with the same rapidity with which he had opened it, as if he had found nothing interesting, or as if he wanted to postpone that particular discovery to a later moment. Then, continuing his inspection along the same cupboard, he tapped with his fingers on another panel lower down. He smiled. "Ah, here." With the tip of a small knife he extracted from his pocket, he pried open an almost invisible crack and opened a secret compartment, skillfully concealed. Inside, there was a single, large tin jar of those used for good quality tea. Holmes took it, unscrewed the lid cautiously, and offered it to Inspector Gregson, after briefly sniffing the contents. "Inspector," he said, with a neutral voice, "I believe this is the infamous, most select infusion that was served to us last evening. Or rather, what made it so special? It will be fundamental evidence during the trial, I have not the slightest doubt." Gregson took the jar, his face growing darker. He sniffed it in turn, with an expression of disgust, then closed it carefully and handed it to one of his men as evidence. "Well, Roger," he said, addressing the handcuffed man with a harshness that boded nothing good for his future, "I believe you and I will have a long conversation at the police station." He made a gesture, and the false butler, who had not uttered a word, was led away without offering the slightest resistance. "And now, Watson, Inspector," said Holmes, with an air almost invigorated by the turn events were taking. "After securing justice for the dispenser of potions, I would say the time has come to make the acquaintance of the talented theatrical company that animated the Spirit evenings." We therefore headed toward the door that led to the main hall, the one that the previous evening had been used as the communication room. Gregson opened it decisively, while Holmes and I followed closely, our lanterns projecting dancing beams of light in the darkness that still reigned there, despite the first lights of dawn, trying to make their way through the heavy curtains still drawn. The impact, even with the cruder light of our lanterns, was notable. The black room, with its walls and ceiling covered in dark velvet to absorb every reflection, seemed even more oppressive and sinister. In the center, around the large round table covered with the funereal black tablecloth, 6 figures sat, or rather, were slumped in their chairs. They had clearly been surprised in sleep, or perhaps were still partially under the effect of the substances they had helped to spread. Now, in the direct light of our lamps, they appeared stripped of every mysterious or authoritative aura, reduced to a group of individuals with tired, defeated, and in some cases, openly hostile appearances. I immediately recognized the woman who called herself Lady Araminta, now deprived of her exaggerated makeup and eccentric clothes. Without those artifices, Josephine Cork, as Gregson would later confirm to be her real name, appeared simply as a middle-aged woman, whose features, perhaps once attractive, were marked by a life of expedience and, I suspected, excesses. Beside her, the imposing figure of Alastair Thorne had considerably diminished. Without his long false beard, which now lay, along with a grey wig, sadly abandoned on the table like a hunting trophy, and his ceremonial robe, the individual was only a man in his 50s, with a marked face and the vacant gaze of one who has seen better days and lost too many battles against his own demons. The group was completed by an elderly man of apparently benign and venerable appearance, the perfect type to impersonate a wise grandfather or benevolent spirit guide, but whose gaze now fixed on us with poorly concealed acrimony. A woman in her 30s, still pleasant despite fatigue and disorder, who must have interpreted Holmes's deceased wife with such passion the previous evening. Another man, about the same age, of distinguished but worn appearance, like a provincial actor more accustomed to hisses than applause, and a sprightly and lively old woman, whose bright little eyes, now devoid of any feigned devotion, seemed to rapidly assess the situation, perhaps seeking an escape route or a way to deny any involvement. It was evident that this was not the real Mrs. Pemberton, whom we had left sleeping on the landing, but another skilled character actress. Finally, huddled in a chair and trembling like a leaf, there was a boy of ephebic and androgynous appearance, no more than 16 or 17 years old, probably used to impersonate spirits of children or young maidens. Holmes approached the table with slow steps, his tall and slender figure dominating the scene. He ran the beam of his lantern from one face to another, like an orchestra conductor inspecting his musicians before a particularly difficult performance. An ironic, almost cruel smile creased his thin lips. "Ladies, gentlemen," he began, his voice cutting through the tense silence of the room, "I must sincerely compliment all of you. Last evening's performance was, in its way, a masterpiece of dramatic art and psychological deception. I have rarely witnessed such a profusion of acting talent employed for such deplorable purposes." He addressed the woman in her 30s directly. "You, miss, or madam," he said with sharp gallantry, interpreted my bereaved and deceased consort, Lady Wayne, with a pathos and intensity that would not look out of place on the most prestigious stages of Covent Garden. A truly memorable performance. The woman blushed violently under that penetrating gaze, lowering her eyes with a mixture of shame and perhaps a residue of professional pride. Holmes then moved the beam of his lantern to the gaunt face of the false medium. "And you, Mr. Irons, or should I say, Master Alastair Thorne, we have not seen each other since that memorable season of Hamlet at the Lyceum Theatre about 10 years ago, is that not so? A triumph, if I recall correctly, a record of consecutive performances. Then you disappeared from the scene. Persistent rumors spoke of gambling debts that had forced you to a precipitous flight, of your unfortunate indulgence in the opium dens of Limehouse. I see with pleasure, or perhaps I should say with regret, that you have found a new, albeit considerably less honorable, stage on which to exercise your undoubted histrionic gifts. Irons lifted his gaze with difficulty, his bloodshot eyes betraying sleepless nights and deep prostration. "Times are hard for actors of a certain caliber, Mr. Holmes," he murmured in a hoarse voice. "Not all of us can afford the luxury of choosing our roles or of refusing generous offers." "I understand," replied Holmes, with a coldness that admitted no compassion. "Necessity sharpens the wit and sometimes obscures the conscience." He bent down and picked up from the table, near the wig and false beard, a small object of wax painted with care. "Ah, here. This, Inspector," he said, showing it to Gregson, "I believe may explain the slight, almost imperceptible physiognomic anomaly I had noticed on the face of our Master Thorne during the séance. A false nose, of excellent workmanship. Evidently, it served Mr. Irons not only to alter his features and make himself less recognizable, but primarily, I suspect, to allow him to insert protective filters inside it, or somehow to limit the continuous inhalation of the narcotic vapors that saturated the air of this room. A precaution as astute as it was necessary for one who must maintain lucidity while all around lose it." Gregson shook his head, muttering something about the incredible effrontery and ingenuity of London criminals. Then, with a sharp nod, gave orders to his men to handcuff the entire company of actors. "And now," said Holmes, when the room was cleared of those defeated and lamenting figures, and while the first, uncertain lights of dawn were beginning to penetrate through the cracks of the curtains that the officers were finally beginning to draw aside. "After securing justice for the protagonist actors, the time has come to flush out the extras and discover the secrets of the scenery." Holmes moved with his customary feline agility toward the heavy black curtains that still enveloped much of the room. "Inspector," he said, with a tone that admitted no delay, "have your men carefully search every cavity, every dark corner behind these draperies, and tell them to be careful. I suspect our special effects were not entirely automatic and might reserve some surprises." While Gregson's men, now more numerous and equipped with powerful acetylene lanterns that pierced every residual darkness, began to inspect with palpable nervousness the space between the curtains and the walls, a task made more disturbing by the spectral silence of the apartment. A sudden, almost imperceptible, rustle of fabric was heard from the darkest corner of the room, the one until then least illuminated. "Attention, something is moving," cried a young officer, his voice cracked with a note of authentic fear, leaping backward. Before the others could fully react, from behind a wide and particularly thick drape of black velvet that concealed a deep recess, emerged not as distinct figures, but as denser shadows detaching themselves from the surrounding darkness, some dark and incredibly agile forms. They were perfectly camouflaged with the black background, and only their sudden movement betrayed them. They seemed like mischievous sprites or nocturnal creatures surprised by light, and moved with supernatural rapidity and silence, trying to slip away toward the corridor door like black smoke. Even the most experienced officers, caught off guard by those sudden apparitions and their disturbing capacity for camouflage, had a moment of hesitation, a shiver of superstitious fear. I myself, I confess, felt a cold shiver run down my spine. For an instant, Miss Aldrich's stories of demons, with whom we had spoken the previous morning, seemed to assume sinister concreteness. But Sherlock Holmes did not lose his composure. "Take them," thundered his voice, firm and authoritative, breaking the spell of fear. Shaken by the command, the officers threw themselves in pursuit. A brief and confused scuffle followed, in which the small figures writhed with the agility of monkeys and the cunning of wild animals. Young Officer Miller, demonstrating remarkable sang-froid after the initial fright, managed alone to seize two of them, tackling them with an expertise that earned him a nod of approval from a still slightly pale Gregson. Holmes, who had observed the scene with a mixture of amusement and scientific interest, approached the group of prisoners, now held firmly. "No fear, Inspector, no fear, Watson," he said, with an almost imperceptible smile. "No demons, I assure you. Only human skill taken to an extraordinary level. He bent over one of the little creatures, a particularly small and thin individual who was still struggling weakly, and with a rapid and decisive gesture, stripped off the hood and black silk mask that completely covered his face. Underneath appeared a face with unmistakably oriental features, olive skin, and eyelids and eye contours painted an intense and opaque black. "As you can see," explained Holmes, while the other sprites were unmasked, "here are the true artificers of the subtler levitations and disappearances, masters in the ancient art of shadow theatre, or some variant thereof. Their ability to camouflage themselves in darkness and move without sound is the fruit of years of training. I imagine their task, besides manipulating lights and shadows, was to silently move the participants' chairs." Holmes approached one of the heavy black chairs remaining around the table, gave it a light lateral push with the tip of his foot, and it slid away docilely on the floor with a fluid and almost imperceptible movement, provided, as I had occasion to note since last evening, with small and well-oiled wheels hidden under their base, an aid to mobility as discreet as it was effective for their purposes. Chapter 12, The Path of Souls. When even the last experts of shadow theatre had been led away, handcuffed and muttering in their incomprehensible language, an almost unnatural silence fell over the large black room, broken only by the labored breathing of the officers and the rustle of curtains finally being drawn aside completely, letting the grey and uncertain light of London dawn begin to reveal the squalid reality of that place of deceptions. "Well, Inspector," said Holmes, his voice ringing clear and precise in that sudden void, "we have the actors, the extras, and the special effects technicians." And with an ironic gesture, he indicated Ian Irons's false nose, which an officer had collected from the table, and some extremely thin black threads, almost invisible, that still hung from the ceiling in strategic corners, undoubtedly used to manipulate small objects or veils during the manifestations. Now, if my logic does not deceive me, and rarely does it, there remains only to find the true playwright of this comedy of horrors, the director, and I would dare say, the principal author of this complex and poisonous production. He looked around the room, his keen gaze seeming to weigh every architectural detail, every shadow, every anomaly. "As I mentioned to you last evening, Inspector," he said, addressing Gregson, who listened with a mixture of admiration and impatience, observing the building's facade from outside, one can observe that the arrangement of windows on this third floor presents singularities that suggest a significant and not casual alteration of the apartment's original floor plan. And when an environment is remodeled so radically, it is often to conceal something illicit or compromising. He paused, then continued with a more direct tone. "While the doctor and I take a closer look at the corridors and at what Master Thorne so pompously called the rooms of Swedenborg, I would suggest, Inspector, that you have your men concentrate on the north wall of this main hall, the one facing the street. Have it examined carefully, centimetre by centimetre. A comparison between the internal space we see and what should exist based on the building's external structure might reveal some interesting discrepancy." Gregson, who had by now learned to trust blindly in my friend's intuitions, however enigmatic they might appear at first, nodded decisively. "Officer Miller," he called, addressing the young policeman who had distinguished himself for his promptness, "take a couple of men and a powerful lantern with you. Inspect every centimetre of the north wall of this room, as Mr. Holmes said. Look for anything unusual, hollow sounds, cracks, misalignments, and report to me immediately." While the officers set to work, tapping on walls and scrutinizing every corner, Holmes signaled me to follow him. "Come, Watson. It is time to visit the true realm of spirits, or at least what remains of it." We ventured into one of the narrow and dark corridors that branched off from the Black Hall. Now, in the light of the powerful acetylene lantern that Holmes carried, I could better observe the details that in my trance of the previous night had escaped me. The walls had been hastily covered with dark and opaque fabric, probably poor-quality velvet, stretched on light wooden frames, with the clear intent of muffling sounds and creating a claustrophobic isolation effect. We came to a thin door, also painted funeral black. Holmes opened it cautiously, revealing one of the two cubicles I had visited the previous night. It was a cramped environment, no larger than a small closet or ship's cabin. The walls facing toward the apartment's interior, those that in my hallucination had seemed to me made of condensed light, and through which I had glimpsed the dancing souls, were actually made of large sheets of white frosted glass, mounted on wooden frames. Several of these sheets were cracked or even shattered, and glass shards glittered sinisterly on the dark floor. "Here, Watson," commented Holmes, indicating with a nod the broken glass, "the cause of the commotion that so abruptly interrupted your celestial conversation with little Lucy. I myself inadvertently broke these panes, attempting to interrupt a forced enchantment that was beginning to envelop me as well. The sound of the hunting horn I had brought with me, and which was the agreed signal with Gregson, did the rest. I observed with a mixture of revulsion and bitter, disappointing lucidity that miserable and squalid environment. It was difficult, almost impossible, to believe that my mind, under the effect of the drug and suggestion, could have transformed that narrow cubbyhole into the luminous and serene world of spirits, where I had wept tears of joy and sorrow for a daughter never had. The deception had been as skillful as it was cruel. "With a powerful light source placed behind these frosted glass screens," explained Holmes, indicating some blackened lamp holders fixed to the cubicle's external wall, "and with a skillful play of backlighting and silhouettes maneuvered in darkness, one can create the illusion of luminous, ethereal figures that appear and disappear on command. A trick as old as the world, Watson, already known to Egyptian priests and medieval necromancers, but always incredibly effective on a suggestible audience whose senses have already been appropriately altered." We were about to leave that sad testimony to human credulity when we heard an excited cry coming from the main hall. "Inspector, Mr. Holmes, here, I think I've found something." It was young Officer Miller's voice. We hurried to retrace our steps. We found Miller and the other officers gathered before the north wall, precisely in the section skillfully masked by the false fireplace in dark stucco and the fake bookshelf laden with volumes of ancient appearance but irrelevant content. "What is it, Miller?" asked Gregson anxiously. "This part of the wall, sir," replied the officer, indicating a precise point near the false fireplace. "It sounds decidedly hollow. And look here, Mr. Holmes," he added, addressing my friend with respect that bordered on veneration. "There's a very thin crack, almost invisible along the wall. It looks like a door." Holmes approached, his eyes shining with intense satisfaction. He rapidly examined the structure, his analytical mind working at full capacity. "Excellent, Officer Miller. A keen observation. You will go far." Then, with the confidence of one who has already foreseen every move, he concentrated on a stone of the false fireplace. Despite its solid appearance, Holmes, with precise pressure and a slight lateral movement that only one who knew the mechanism could have intuited, made it click, with an almost imperceptible metallic click, but which resounded very loudly in the tense silence of the room. The entire wall section, fireplace, bookshelf, and everything else, rotated silently on hidden hinges, like the massive door of a vault, revealing a dark and narrow opening that led to an unknown space. "Before proceeding further," said Holmes, his voice having become grave and his gaze hardened, he extracted from his pocket a clean linen handkerchief and some small cotton swabs. "Watson, Inspector," he continued, offering each of us part of the cotton and a piece of his handkerchief, "please cover your nose and mouth carefully. If my deductions are correct, the atmosphere inside this hideout might be saturated with vapors not exactly salubrious, and certainly responsible for part of the experiences of this building's tenants." Then he continued, "An intelligent and desperate adversary understands when the game is lost, but prudence, especially when dealing with a chemist expert in particular substances, is never too much." Before entering, Holmes, with a rare smile that betrayed almost affectionate amusement, addressed me. "By the way, Watson," he said, as he himself prepared to do likewise with meticulous care, "I must give you my most sincere compliments for your acute observation during last evening's séance. It did not escape me at all that you noticed a supposed, and rather bizarre, physiognomic anomaly of mine. Evidently, proximity to the world of spirits, or perhaps Mr. Rogers' tea, temporarily sharpened your perceptive abilities." Then, with the same rapidity with which he had spoken, he precisely inserted small and almost invisible cotton filters into his own nostrils. those same ones that, in my vision clouded by the drug, I had mistaken for an unnatural swelling of his nose. I had promptly recognized the characteristic odor of certain vegetable preparations and had opportunely protected myself to maintain my lucidity, an advantage that proved, as often happens, decisive. Chapter 13. The Control Room. A sweetish and pungent odor, an indefinable mixture of aromatic herbs, chemical substances, and something vaguely organic in decomposition, hit us like a slap as soon as Holmes, with his nostrils now protected, cautiously pushed the secret door, which opened completely with a slight creak. It was an effluvium so intense and nauseating that it forced me to press the handkerchief more firmly against my nose and mouth, and I saw even Inspector Gregson grimace with disgust and imperceptibly retreat. Only Holmes seemed immune, or perhaps his concentration was such as to make him insensitive to such sensory details. "Watson, Inspector, after me, if you would be so kind," he said, his voice slightly muffled by the fabric, but firm as always. "And keep the lanterns well raised. We do not know what or who awaits us." With his tall and slender figure silhouetted against the darkness, Holmes was the first to cross the threshold, his acetylene lantern projecting a cone of white and implacable light into the unknown. I followed close behind, with Gregson at my heels, both with lanterns raised, ready to illuminate every corner of what promised to be the true heart of the operation, the control room from which the diabolical puppeteer had pulled the strings of his cynical comedy. We found ourselves in a room of reasonable dimensions, but which appeared cramped and suffocating due to the high shelving that covered 3 of the 4 walls, from floor almost to ceiling. They were crammed in a disorder that to an inexpert eye might seem chaotic, but which betrayed its own internal logic, with a myriad of glass jars of every shape and size, bulbous ampullae, crystal retorts, and porcelain vases labeled with minute and indecipherable writing, some in Latin, others with symbols that seemed to belong to some forgotten alchemical grimoire. They contained dried herbs of every color and consistency, powders ranging from chalk white to coal black, from brilliant green to blood red, and mysterious liquids, some clear and colorless, others dense and opalescent that seemed to quiver with life of their own. On the 4th wall, the one that, according to Holmes's calculations, should face the outside and present a window, there was indeed an opening, but it had been carefully and heavily obscured with black wooden panels and thick velvet drapes, not letting filter the slightest glimmer of daylight that by now illuminated the rest of the apartment. In front of this sealed window, on a small shelf improvised with rough planks, several plants of exotic and decidedly non-ornamental appearance grew weakly, their leaves of a dark green or variegated with disturbing spots, illuminated by the yellowish and constant light of a powerful petroleum lamp equipped with a concave reflector, which concentrated its rays like an artificial and malign sun. In the center of the room, a robust work table, stained by burns and residues of encrusted substances, was cluttered with an impressive battery of instruments. I recognized test tubes and beakers of every size, glass-blown alembics of twisted forms, porcelain and hard stone mortars with their respective pestles, precision scales protected by glass cases, and a myriad of other utensils that clearly belonged to the armamentarium of an expert chemist or pharmacologist dedicated to unconventional experiments. Everything, although arranged with meticulous and almost maniacal order, emanated an aura of feverish, clandestine activity, and I could not help thinking profoundly sinister. And there, in a corner of the room, near the work table but slightly apart, as if he had been surprised by a sudden noise and had instinctively tried to make himself less visible, stood a man. He was motionless, almost petrified, upright against one of the shelves, his back pressed against the jars, as if he were trying to merge with them, visibly holding his breath. He was tall and incredibly thin, his gangly figure wrapped in a long dressing gown of dark and worn fabric, threadbare at the elbows, and stained with splashes of chemical substances of every color. The color of his skin, in the few visible patches, was of a cerulean pallor, almost cadaverous, which contrasted impressively with the inflamed and watery redness of his eyes, enormously magnified by thick glasses with steel frames. A heavy handkerchief, or perhaps an improvised and blackened surgical mask, hermetically covered his nose and mouth, tied tightly behind his neck with laces. When the combined light of our 3 lanterns fully invested him, tearing him from the protective shadow in which he had taken refuge, the man had an almost imperceptible start. His eyes, behind the thick lenses, widened for an instant, betraying a spark of surprise and acute, animal fear, before lowering with an air of complete and definitive resignation, like that of a condemned man who hears the executioner's steps approaching. None of us spoke for a long moment. The silence in the control room was broken only by our labored breathing, slightly filtered by the handkerchiefs, and the distant, muffled hum of life awakening in London streets. It was clear that we had found the director, the arcane chemist who, from behind the scenes, had woven the plot of that diabolical and ingenious fraud. It was Sherlock Holmes, as always, who broke the tension, his voice, though slightly muffled by the fabric of the handkerchief that partially covered his face, sharp and precise as a scalpel. Holmes observed the man with that penetrating analytical intensity of his, the lantern beam methodically moving from his face to his hands, from the stained dressing gown to the instruments on the table. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to us. The stains on the dressing gown present that characteristic green-brownish coloration typical of solanaceous extracts. The fingers of the right hand show calluses from extensive writing, but also recent chemical burns on the thumb and index finger, the mark of one who personally handles boiling reagents. The glasses, of American make judging by the frame, have been repaired at least 3 times with copper wire, the habit of one accustomed to the self-sufficiency of provincial university laboratories. He approached a step closer, studying some notes scattered on the table. The handwriting is unmistakable, that same elegant rightward inclination, that peculiar form of the lowercase g that I remember well. And then there is this. He indicated a pile of opened envelopes on a shelf, correspondence from the Virginia Botanical Society, addressed to Professor D. Fassbender. Add to that the apparent age, the build, and especially that rare combination of botanical and chemical competence evidenced by this laboratory. He stopped, fixing the man with a gaze that admitted no denials. "We have never met in person, but your writing and your theories are well known to me from our correspondence of years ago." It was then that he pronounced the name. "Professor Douglas Fassbender, if my memory and information do not err," he began, slowly moving his lantern beam to illuminate the man's ashen face. "Former esteemed, though controversial, member of the Royal Horticultural Society, from which you were expelled, if I do not misremember, a couple of years ago, for certain theories of yours somewhat too heterodox and for unauthorized experiments on some plant species with singular properties, known in the most restricted scientific circles for your pioneering, though never officially published, studies on the alkaloids present in some rare hallucinogenic mushrooms from Mexico and their profound influences on the human psyche." The man, hearing his name and the precise, almost insolent description of his academic past, had another slight start, as if struck by an electric shock. He slowly raised his gaze, and his inflamed eyes, enormously magnified by the thick lenses, fixed on Holmes with a mixture of stupor and gloomy resignation. He nodded once, a dry and almost imperceptible movement of his head. It was a mute confession. Holmes, without awaiting a verbal response that evidently would not come easily, moved decisively toward the external wall of the room, the one on which the carefully obscured window opened. With an energetic gesture, he tore away the heavy black wooden panels and the velvet drapes that sealed it, letting the grey and cold light of London dawn finally flood the clandestine laboratory. A gust of fresh air, charged with the humid smell of the awakening city, entered to purify, at least partially, the mephitic atmosphere of the room, dense with the sweetish and pungent effluvia of chemical preparations. "Now you may lighten your protections, Watson, Inspector," said Holmes, removing the cotton swabs from his nose with a gesture of relief. "The bulk of the volatile danger should be dissipated, or at least sufficiently diluted, but I still advise not breathing too deeply near certain containers." We obeyed gratefully, breathing with a mixture of relief and residual apprehension the less vitiated air, although the characteristic odor of the laboratory persisted, almost impregnated in the walls themselves. Holmes addressed the professor again, who remained motionless and silent on his stool, his gaze now fixed on the dusty floor, as if seeking there an answer or an escape route he knew did not exist. "And to think, Professor," continued Holmes, with a tone that was difficult to define. There was a trace of reproach, but also, it seemed to me, a shade of that cold, almost academic curiosity he felt in the face of a particularly ingenious criminal mind, that we have also exchanged a brief but interesting correspondence several years ago now. You were still in the Americas, esteemed professor of botany at a Virginia university, if I do not err, and I was preparing my little monograph, which you perhaps remember, on the different types of tobacco and the distinctive characteristics of their ashes. I still remember with pleasure your acute and precise observations on certain varieties of Nicotiana rustica, used by the indigenous tribes of South America. He paused, his gaze becoming more penetrating, almost as if he wanted to probe the tormented soul of the man before him. And how curious, and at the same time tragic, fate is, do you not find, Professor, that precisely you, with your profound and recognized botanical knowledge, were in all probability the one who, with your initial studies and academic publications, contributed significantly to adding, or at least expanding with abundance of details, the treatment dedicated to Datura stramonium in the principal and most authoritative European manuals of botany and horticulture. Saying these last words, with theatrical timing that never failed to achieve its effect, Sherlock Holmes extracted from the inner pocket of his jacket the small volume bound in dark leather that I had noticed earlier at Baker Street. He opened it carefully, rapidly leafing through the pages until he found the one marked by a thin red silk ribbon that served as a bookmark. The professor, at that sight, seemed to shrink further on his stool, his head bowed, as if he already knew what was about to happen. "Here it is," announced Holmes, his voice taking on an almost didactic tone, like a lecturer illustrating a discovery to his audience. He began to read from the volume, which I recognized as a preliminary copy, perhaps a proof reserved for printing, of the compendium of toxic and medicinal plants that I knew was being prepared by the Royal Horticultural Society, a work to which Holmes himself had discreetly contributed with some of his observations. "Common Jimsonweed, scientifically known as Datura stramonium," read Holmes with clear and articulated voice, "is a vigorous annual herbaceous plant belonging to the Solanaceae family, the same as belladonna and tobacco, characterized by an unpleasant and penetrating odor when the leaves are bruised." Holmes raised his gaze from the book for an instant, fixing Fassbender intensely. An odor that, although masked by incenses and perfumes in the apartment above, did not entirely escape my trained sense of smell. He resumed reading. Its fruit is a distinctive capsule, ovoid, erect, about the size of a common walnut, and densely covered with sharp and pungent spines, which has earned it popular names such as thorn apple, devil's chestnut, or, in the American colonies, thorn apple or Jamestown weed. Inside this leathery capsule, which at maturity opens longitudinally in 4 valves, are found numerous small black or brownish seeds of characteristic kidney shape, about 3 millimeters long. Holmes raised his eyes again, and this time his gaze fell on a small, disturbing, spiny fruit, similar to the one I myself had noticed the previous morning in Fleet Street, which now lay on Fassbender's work table, next to a cluster of identical fruits, evidently freshly picked from one of the plants under cultivation near the obscured window. Holmes indicated it with a nod. "A fruit like this, Professor, unmistakable, do you not find?" He returned to his book. Common appellations such as devil's weed, witch's herb, or angel's trumpet, the latter referring to the shape of its white or violet flowers, derive from its noted and most powerful narcotic, sedative, and above all, properties capable of inducing vivid and often terrifying hallucinations. Such effects, due to a complex mixture of alkaloids present in all parts of the plant, but particularly concentrated in the seeds and flowers, have been exploited since time immemorial, both for therapeutic purposes by herbalists and physicians of antiquity to alleviate pain and spasms, and more frequently, in ritual and magical spiritual contexts, by shamans, healers, and priests of many indigenous tribes of the North American continent and other cultures. to induce prophetic visions, altered states of consciousness, and supposed communications with the world of spirits. Holmes suspended his reading for a moment, letting those words, so pertinent to our investigation, settle in the heavy air of the laboratory. I saw Inspector Gregson slowly shake his head, an expression of growing bewilderment and disgust on his face. The Royal Horticultural Society itself, conscious of the intrinsic dangers of this species, has long advised gardeners and landowners concerned about its presence to uproot the plant carefully or have it removed by expert personnel, always taking care to handle it wearing robust protective gloves, given its toxicity even through simple contact with bruised leaves or fruits. Holmes raised his gaze, and his grey eyes, cold as steel, pointed implacably at Fassbender. Certainly, seeds can travel and remain dormant, Professor, but the presence of these flourishing Datura stramonium plants in active cultivation here under the artificial light of your lamp. And with a broad gesture, he indicated the pots aligned near the obscured window. And your well-known, though controversial, botanical and pharmacological expertise suggest in an unequivocal manner an intentional, scientific, and targeted cultivation, rather than a fortuitous and casual discovery of a weed. The hedgehog that Dr. Watson so acutely found yesterday morning in Fleet Street. And here Holmes extracted from his evidence bag the small spiny fruit, holding it cautiously through the linen handkerchief, is nothing but the unfortunate, for you, confirmation of your familiarity and your deliberate and continued use of this powerful and most dangerous plant for your nefarious experiments on human credulity. Holmes closed the book with a sharp snap, whose sound echoed sinisterly in the small laboratory. Professor Douglas Fassbender, faced with that logical and scientific demonstration that was unassailable, with that chain of precise and implacable deductions that nailed him without escape to his responsibilities, could not endure further. Every residual trace of composure, every attempt to mask his guilt behind a veil of resignation, vanished. His gangly body was shaken by a violent, uncontrollable tremor. He lowered his head even more, hiding his face in his thin hands stained with chemical substances, and finally burst into subdued and hoarse weeping, made of dry sobs and silent tears that streaked his ashen cheeks, a weeping that spoke of shame, defeat, and perhaps pain too long repressed. It was at that moment that, almost by a conditioned reflex from my medical profession, I felt the need to make a clarification, perhaps to mitigate the harshness of the condemnation I felt looming over that destroyed man, or perhaps simply to re-establish a fragment of scientific objectivity in that situation so charged with emotion. But Holmes, I intervened, my voice sounding strange even to my ears after the long silence, if my memory does not deceive me, and despite its undoubted toxicity, stramonium extract, or rather, preparations derived from datura, are they not substances that we physicians, though with extreme caution and in minimal dosages, sometimes prescribe? I remember reading of their use, in the past, to alleviate bronchial spasms in asthma, or as a mild sedative in certain cases of nervous exhaustion or in some particularly acute forms of hysteria. It is not, in itself, an intrinsically and uniquely criminal substance, if used with expertise and discernment. Holmes turned slowly toward me, an eyebrow slightly arched, an expression I knew well and which often preluded one of his sharp but erudite clarifications. "My dear Watson," he began, and in his tone there was that particular mixture of affectionate condescension and implacable logic that characterized him. "What you affirm is quite true. Many of the most powerful substances that nature offers us possess this duality, this intrinsic ambivalence. They can be remedy or poison, salvation or damnation." He paused, his gaze falling again on Fassbender's slumped figure. "But permit me to remind you in this regard of the immortal words of Paracelsus. He wrote with prophetic wisdom, Omnia venenum sunt, nec sine veneno quicquam existit. Dosis sola facit, ut venenum non fit. All things are poison, and nothing exists without poison. Only the dose makes the poison not take effect." A slight, bitter smile creased Holmes's lips. A maxim that, I would say, fits perfectly before one who, perhaps, in his most intimate and distorted convictions, considers himself not a simple chemist, but one of the last true alchemists. Then, with a tone that mixed cold, almost surgical admiration for criminal ingenuity with deep and implacable moral disapproval, Holmes again addressed the sobbing professor, who had lifted his tear-streaked face for an instant, almost strung by those words. "Dear Professor," continued Holmes, "I have always considered yours a truly brilliant mind, capable of uncommon intuitions and profound understanding in the field of botany and pharmacology, as demonstrated by your early, promising works. But I must confess that I would never have expected your undoubted ingenuity could reach such rarefied, such elaborate heights of cynical manipulation, organizing a company of actors of a certain talent, though perhaps decadent or desperately seeking employment, and orchestrating an entire, complex mechanism that rests on supposedly scientific and mystical writings, quoting Madame Blavatsky and the visionary Swedenborg by heart with the sole purpose of conferring an aura of respectability and doctrinal depth to a vulgar fraud, is truly a notable work from an intellectual point of view, however morally abject." Holmes paused, letting his words, precise and cutting, achieve their full effect on the destroyed man. Even the same meticulous precision with which the movements of the guests, from the séance hall to the so-called Swedenborg rooms, were managed, those disappearances and appearances studied to the second, that ballet of wheeled chairs and Chinese shadows, must have required hours, days, if not months, of meticulous training, incessant rehearsals, almost military coordination. My friend looked around the laboratory, his gaze seeming to catalogue every single vial, every instrument. Certainly, even the complete restructuring of that large apartment on the upper floor, with its thin walls designed to let sounds and odors filter through, its hidden passages and secret rooms used as theaters of illusions, must have cost you several hundred, if not thousands, of sovereigns. A considerable investment, there is no denying. A flash of sarcasm shone in Holmes's eyes. Certainly, your undoubted talent in pharmacology and your botanical expertise must have relieved you of quite a few worries and expenses regarding the procurement of raw materials, using the same weed, Datura stramonium, which, as you know better than anyone else, can now be found commonly even in uncultivated lands and at the margins of roads here in London, or which you yourself have so diligently and scientifically cultivated in these pots. And he indicated with a contemptuous gesture the plants under the lamp, both in carefully calibrated and almost imperceptible doses, as a mild soporific and powerful suggestive agent to be administered in the tea offered in the antechamber, and in considerably more substantial and dangerous doses, to be diffused as vapors in the air of the Black Room or directly administered to the most receptive subjects before entrance to the White Rooms to induce deep and personalized hallucinations. Well, all this certainly simplified your life and budget, avoiding the risks and costs connected with procuring illicit substances or those more difficult to obtain on the clandestine market. Fassbender, who had stopped sobbing, lifted for a moment his tear-streaked face marked by deep fatigue, a look of mute, desolate defeat in his eyes magnified by the lenses. "However, Professor," continued Holmes, and his tone became strangely milder, almost devoid of accusation, as if speaking more to a wayward colleague than to a hardened criminal. "From man of science to man who once walked the paths of science, or from gentlemen which I know you, in a perhaps not too remote past, certainly were, I beg you to answer with sincerity this last question of mine. Why all this? I do not see you, despite the evidence of the facts, as a vulgar swindler interested solely in sordid gain, although that was certainly no secondary motive of the enterprise. There is something else, is there not? There is a deeper, more personal origin to this drift of yours. My impression is that you are more a scientist who has lost his way, perhaps driven by frustrated ambition, unbearable pain, or an obsession that has devoured your integrity. What drove you, Professor Fassbender, to set up such a complex and so profoundly cruel charade?" There was a long, heavy silence. Fassbender drew a trembling breath, the sobs having subsided, leaving room for a kind of exhausted resignation. Then, with a broken voice, barely a whisper, he began to speak. End of part 2. You have listened to the second part of the case of the March Burr, an unpublished Sherlock Holmes tale, a pseudo-biblia narration. We hope you enjoyed this journey. The third and final part will be available on this channel next Friday at 9 p.m. Remember to like the video and subscribe for a new audiobook every Friday and explore our playlists for other genres. Thank you for listening. This work is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and events are products of the author's imagination or used fictitiously. Any reference to real people, events, or places existing or having existed is purely coincidental.